Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Generations United's Learning Network webinar, Grandfamilies, Legal Relationship Options, and Available Financial Resources. The moderators today will be myself, Sherry Steinig, and Leah Bradley. We're both on staff at Generations United. Generations United works to improve the lives of children, youth, and older people through intergenerational practice and public policies. We share resources and connect practitioners around the U.S. And the world. One of the ways we do that is through these webinars and our website. There's a number of resources available for free on our website, as well as the ability to check out our calendar for upcoming training events or additional webinars, signing up for our weekly e-newsletter, and connecting with us through social media. This is the 5th webinar in our current series on intergenerational topics made possible with a grant from Redlich Foundation. We will continue monthly webinars through April. Please watch the calendar on our website or our e-newsletter for more information on upcoming learning and networking events. I'm going to quickly go over a couple of housekeeping items before turning the webinar over to our presenters. We have experienced some challenges with this technology during the past. I want to alert you that there may be a slight delay when moving through the slides. Our speakers will keep going, and the slides will eventually catch up. If you are having any difficulty hearing, you can listen through your computer speakers, or you can also dial in and listen from your phone by, in the audio tab, clicking the telephone button, and vice versa. You will be muted during the webinar, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. Please use the question or chat function to ask questions or make comments at any time. The questions will come to me and Leah, and we will be sure to ask some of our presenters. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and PowerPoint slides should be available within a couple of days. Because of the holiday weekend, I would say early next week on our website. And you can see right in the presentation here is a link to where that'll be posted. You'll also receive this link in a follow-up email that you'll receive from us after the webinar is over. Finally, please take a few minutes to complete the short survey you will see when you leave the webinar. We rely on your feedback and comments to plan future webinars. So we are thrilled today to have Heidi Redlich, Epstein, and Anna Beltran joining us today to discuss Grandfamilies. Heidi is an attorney, social worker, and the Director of Kinship Policy and the Assistant Director of State Projects at the American Bar Association's Center on Children and the Law in Washington, D.C. In her role as Director of Kinship Policy, Heidi helped develop and currently co-manages the Grandfamilies State Law and Policy Resource Center in partnership with Casey Family Programs and Generations United. As Assistant Director of State Projects, Heidi co-manages the award-winning Permanency Barriers Project in various states, where she provides technical assistance, legal training, and statewide child welfare training to judges, attorneys, caseworkers, and service providers. She presents at conferences on various legal issues related to kinship care and permanency nationally. Prior to her work at the ABA, Heidi was a law guardian for Legal Aid of Maryland and a residential social worker for female juvenile offenders in upstate New York. Also joining Heidi today is Anna Beltran. Anna is an attorney, special advisor to Generations United, and the founding director of our National Center on Grandfamilies. Anna has worked to help enact and implement several federal laws to support grandfamilies, including the National Family Caregiver Support Program, Legacy, and the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act. Anna frequently provides training and technical assistance about the issues facing grandfamilies at conferences and events around the country. Among her presentations, she helped design and deliver a satellite training on affordable housing issues for staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and trained judges and state legislatures on the Fostering Connections Act. She was featured at several Capitol Hill briefings and as a keynote speaker at the Smithsonian Institution premiere of the documentary Big Mama. Anna has authored many Generations United reports, several articles in various publications and academic journals, including The Gerontologist, the Public Policy and Aging Report, the Journal of Aging and Social Policy, and the Journal of Gerontological Social Work. As someone who was raised in part by her grandmother, she also has a personal commitment to these families. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Heidi and Anna. So take it away, Heidi.
Miss Heidi must be on mute. Heidi, this is Anna. Unmute yourself.
I'm wondering if we lost Heidi in the transition.
I don't know. She says she's here. Well, we can go ahead and get started. I'll take over until we see her.
Okay, I'm going to switch the presenter to you, Anna.
Okay. Pardon me. We weren't ready for technical problems here. Most of you are probably already familiar with what is kinship care, or what we call grandfamilies. But just a bit of an overview. There are about almost 8 million children living with relatives with or without parents in the home in the United States. And of those, at least 2.5 million have no parents in the home at all. The majority of these children are outside the formal foster care system. And even though that's true, the foster care system still relies heavily on relatives. About a quarter of the foster care system is made up of relatives caring for children. Any grandparent, as we all know, can unexpectedly find himself raising children. This is regardless of any kind of factor. They're all over the country. We're all over the country in all kinds of geographic areas and socioeconomic groups and races and ethnicities. And, of course, the issues that can lead to grandfamilies, we've all heard of these. Military deployment is a big one, as is substance abuse, incarceration. Of course, death of a parent is another frequently occurring causal factor. We're going to go through the legal relationships that grandparents can have with the children they raise or may not have with the children they raise. So there are various forms of what we call care and custody. There's really a continuum. Many grandparents, and we don't have exact data on this because we don't know, well, it's just not collected, of how many are in what we call informal care, meaning how many grandparents are raising grandchildren outside the formal foster care system without any kind of legal relationship to those children. We're also going to talk about formal foster care and legal custody and guardianship, subsidized guardianship, and adoption. So this is kind of the continuum, going from the most informal to the most formal. Informal caregivers often do this because it's difficult to get a legal relationship to the children, or maybe they don't want it. Maybe they don't want to be the parent to that person's child because that person's child is their child, and they don't want to change the relationships in the family. And it's also just very difficult and costly to get a legal relationship. So there are many reasons why they're informal caregivers.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I got audio back. So sorry, everybody. Anna, thank you for pinch hitting for me.
Oh, sure. We'll turn it over to you here on the power of attorney slide.
Okay, so sorry. All right. Anna, if you want to move the slides for me. No, I guess I'm going to move the slides. All right. This is the fun part of you know, having a webinar. You can never know what's going to happen. Sometimes when you're live, you don't even know what's going to happen. So I apologize for that. So where are we?
Power of attorney.
Right? All right, power of attorney. So not to confuse you all, but Anna and I really do kind of go interchangeably in most of these presentations. So this is Heidi now speaking. So we're talking about power of attorney under informal caregivers. So one great option for informal caregivers is to use a power of attorney. These are documents that give specific powers over to the parents, from the parents to the caregiver, without allowing certain exceptions such as consent to marriage or adoption. So sometimes there are specific power of attorney laws that are written in a way that they're specific to certain powers for the parent to relate. One would be school-related, another medical decision-making. And we're going to sort of look at different ways that can be conferred from a parent to a caregiver. The problem with a power of attorney is it really is sort of a short-term fix. They're typically only a 6 months. They only last typically for 6 months. So if you're thinking that this is going to be a long-term situation, and many caregivers don't realize at the beginning that it's a long-term situation, this is not really your best option. It can also easily be revoked by parents. And finally, it does not survive a parent's death. So should that happen while the power of attorney is in effect, the power of attorney would no longer be in effect. So oftentimes the way this is done, the parents complete some sort of form saying, you know, I want to give power of attorney to this person. Okay. So most states have some form of power of attorney law, and they're usually sort of a generic power of attorney law. But if you look, we have a list here on this slide that there are 22 states that specifically have power of attorney laws written for minors. But most states do have some form of power of attorney law that can be used. Washington has something really interesting in that they have a specific power of attorney law that allows a parent to delegate this power to relatives specifically for health care alone. Okay, so the next area that can be used, the next vehicle that can be used for informal caregivers are consent laws. And again, just trying to remember that these are informal caregivers who have not gone to court, have not gotten some sort of formal legal relationship with the child in their care. So we should really make sure that that's the umbrella we're still under. So that is, the situation where mother comes and says to her mother, here's your grandchild, I'll be back in a few weeks, and it turns out to be a few months. So something like that, with power of attorney or with the consent law, it allows that caregiver to access certain services. So state level consent laws allow the caregiver without that custody or guardianship relationship, and that can only be given to them by court, to access school enrollment, school services, medical care, dental care, developmental treatment services. And really the consent law is generally very, very specific about which type and which power of consent it is conferring to the guardian, I'm sorry, to the caregiver. So you have to look at what's the type of treatment and whether sometimes it requires there actually be a written document by the parent giving this consent, and sometimes it can be oral. Some states require the parent to sign and some do not. So really you have to, and I often say this, is people will ask me questions or general questions about a lot of the laws we're going to go over today, and my answer is always it depends. And what it depends on is what state you're in. So one thing that I want to let you know is that both Anna and myself, working on Grandfamilies.org, have compiled all the laws that we're talking about today. So if you want to look up your state specifically and find out, geez, is there an education consent law in my state, or is there a health care consent law, or what does guardianship look like in my state, you can go to grandfamilies.org and take a look for your specific state and see what the laws are in your specific state. Because a lot of the questions I get, it really does depend on what your state law is written. So some of these states require an affidavit from the caregiver if you can't get the parent's signature, and will allow that affidavit to say, hey, look, I am taking care of the child, I am the caregiver, therefore I should be allowed to consent to school enrollment, access services. Which brings us sort of to the next level for next option sort of for an informal caregiver, and that is medical consent. About half the states out there have some form of medical consent allowing a caregiver to access medical services for a child, and you'll see we sort of broken it down into which states give which kind of consent. All of these can be found at grandfamilies.org. Another big area that we get a lot of calls and emails about are educational consent. I've got my niece, nephew, grandchild living with me. How do I enroll them in school? So if you see, 14 states have specific educational consent laws. You'd have to go to each state's law to see sort of what the requirements are. 5 states say that it's not the parent's residence that allows them to access school, but it's actually where the child's living. So therefore, if the child is living at their aunt's house, that is the child's legal residence, and therefore the aunt can enroll them because that is where they're living. Interestingly enough, 2 state examples I want to point out is in Indiana, they call it legal settlement of a student. So basically they determine where that child is eligible for school based on what they call the legal settlement, where that child's being cared for and living. Determines if they're available to go to that school. Texas specifically has a really innovative provision that says a child can also attend a school district, even if they don't live there, as long as the grandparent who lives in that district provides a substantial amount of after-school care for the person. So it might be a convenience factor. Maybe it's not that the child is living with the grandparent, but that the grandparent cares for them before and after school. So for convenience sake, the child would be enrolled in the school that, that is near the grandparent. Okay, so that is really, those are definitely the options for the informal caregiver. So for the formal caregivers, and we call this formal foster care, so there's going to be different levels of caregiving that can be allowed. The first I want to talk about, and Anna mentioned it briefly, was what we call relative or formal foster care. About a quarter of the children in the foster care system are doing so living with relatives. So federal law requires that states always look at a relative first when placing a child. Each child has its own eligibility and licensing criteria, and again, something that you can look at on grandfamilies.org. You can look to see what the different criteria and standards are for licensing in your state. Some states allow procedural protection for relatives who have applied to become foster parents but are denied. Some states allow a child who's in the care and custody of the state to live with a relative who's not licensed. So understanding really every state's a little different. I think that oftentimes what we see is that states are struggling when it comes to licensing. They're really struggling to say, look, all licensing should be the same, whether you're a relative or a non-relative. But a lot of times when they're looking at licensing standards, you'll see that there really is some provision, but not always, to take into account the fact that relatives are different and their homes are going to be different. And so, for example, allowing 4 children, if they're siblings, to live in the home instead of saying, nope, sorry, capacity has to be at 3, and that's what the state law is. So understanding that there should be some flexibility in licensing standards. Some states really do a nice job of that, and some states are trying to get there. So basically, the other thing I want to mention about relative foster care right here is that if a relative is licensed for a child who is what we call Title IV-E eligible, they must receive the same foster care payment as a non-relative foster parent. So I really want to point that out for 4E eligible children. So those are really, that really kind of encapsulates everything I want to talk about foster care today. Honestly, you know, that's its own topic. We could talk about that a lot. I think when a caregiver is trying to determine, do I want to care for the child outside of the formal system, or do I want to care for the child within the formal system, it really is something that they have to sort of weigh what the needs of the child and the needs of their family and sort of their own background when trying to determine that. I think what I hear a lot is I don't really want to be involved in the system. I don't really want to go to court. I don't want social workers in my life. I don't want to have to ask permission to go over state line with the child or to allow the child to sleep at a friend's house. So there's sort of a lot of pros and cons of really becoming a licensed foster care provider for a relative within the system. And the pros really would be that there is a lot more financial support, and I'm going to leave that to Anna to talk about a little later, for relatives who care for the children within the system, as well as social supports. So
hey, Heidi,
area.
Yeah.
Heidi?
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? We just had a question if you could clarify what a Title IV-E eligible child means.
Okay, that's a great question. It's pretty complicated. It basically comes down to, it's a determination that's made by the Child Welfare Agency based on federal standards of what the parent's income is at the time that the child enters the foster care system. And I have to tell you, it's quite antiquated, and it goes really, it goes back to some of the 70s and the 80s for determination. But typically speaking, most children who enter foster care are determined to be 4E eligible. There are a few random states that don't have a lot of what they call 4E eligible children, but it's a pretty complicated analysis the state has to do. But it basically comes down to what was the parent's income or lack of income at the time the child came into care. So I hope that sort of answers it, because it's a very good question, but a long answer to that question. So moving on to legal custody and guardianship. So legal custody and guardianship is a way for a relative caregiver to solidify in the courts the legal relationship between the child and the caregiver. And it allows legal responsibility to make decisions, provide care, and access service be transferred from the parent to another caregiver. The question I probably get the most about custody and guardianship is people are trying to weigh out, gee, what should I what option should I try to choose? Do I choose custody over guardianship? And quite honestly, a lot of states use these terms interchangeably. The historic difference between custody and guardianship really had to do with which court you filed the papers in. It didn't have to do with, you know, how long it lasted or how permanent it was or how safe the child was in the home. It really has to do with where are the papers filed. And typically the term custody is used to refer to custody granted through family or juvenile court. Guardianship used to always be a term that really mostly referred to probate court. So you made a will and you named your guardian, or in administrative code. Nowadays, however, we have subsidized guardianship, which we're going to talk about briefly. And under subsidized guardianship, that really does fall back on the family or juvenile court. So as you can see, the lines, you know, do tend to be blurred between custody and guardianship, and it really depends on what your state decides to call it, frankly. When you have legal custody and guardianship granted by the court, I want to be very clear that it does not terminate parental rights or responsibilities, which sometimes can mean child support. So the parent still has the right at any time to come back to court and ask that the guardianship or the custody be terminated and the child be returned to the custody of the biological parents. When determining custody and guardianship, often the court looks at the parent's preference, so they may decide they want to grant custody or guardianship to a relative. So they will look at the parent's preference and the best interest of the child. So the parent doesn't necessarily need to be in agreement with it, but that is certainly one factor the court looks at. But the bottom line is that it allows caregivers to make decisions for the child and access services, and it prevents the biological family, biological parents from coming back in, you know, and removing the child without a court order of some sort. Okay, so under legal custody and guardianship, there are some subtypes. And I think most of these are sort of self-explanatory from the terms, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these. But joint guardianship, when there's shared custody between the caregiver and the parent. Short-term guardianship, when it's really only for a short amount of time. For example, we used it for military deployment. Standby guardianship, which we're going to talk about when there's a pre-appointed triggering event. We'll talk about that in a minute. Limited guardianship, when the powers of the guardian are limited for a specific right to confer to the guardian. De facto custody, we're also going to talk about when the child's primary, someone has been the child's primary caregiver for a significant period of time in the parent's absence, one can apply to become what's called a de facto custodian. And guardianship by probate. And I think that's probably the one we're most, you know, familiar with in our own lives, and that's when in the will you name, upon the death of a parent, a guardian. So standby guardianship. Standby guardianship really came about when the AIDS epidemic hit. It allows for, if there's a triggering event, either an illness or a death, when that occurs, that's when the guardianship is triggered. That's when the guardian can no longer care for the child and the caregiver, the parent can no longer care for the child and the caregiver can step in and take the guardianship. About half the states have specific standby guardianship statutes. The next area is de facto custodian. And again, I mentioned this briefly, but it's really when someone's been the primary caregiver, you know, mom has dropped the child off at grandma's house, grandma's been the caregiver for a significant period of time, and goes into court and says, look, I really have been the caregiver. I've been the custodian. Just, you know, you court haven't given me the papers yet because I haven't filed for them or for whatever reason. So the court can find that they are the de facto custodian. Different statutes define how long you have to have lived and cared for the child. Most states are around 6 months if the child's under 3, and a year if the child's at least, you know, over the age of 3. And some states don't define it. They just say, you know, basically the definition is anybody who's been acting as a primary caregiver for the child. After the court finds the person to be the de facto custodian, they can then transfer legal custody to that caregiver, and then they have the same standing as the parent. And it's generally based on the best interest of the child, and about 11 states have these laws. They may not call them de facto, they may use other terms for them. Subsidized guardianship. Subsidized guardianship used to be outside and used interchangeably outside and inside the foster care system, but I would say most recently it's really a term of art that's used specifically for a child who is in the foster care system, living with a relative, and they exit the foster care system to guardianship and they get a subsidy. So it's financial support for a child leaving foster care to live permanently with a relative. It does not terminate the parental rights of the parent, so they like all the other custody and guardianships I just talked about, that can be terminated if the parent comes into court and asks for the child to have custody returned. these can be a little difficult to find, but we've worked really hard to put them together on grandfamilies.org, so I recommend that if you want to find out if there's subsidized guardianship in your state, that you take a look at grandfamilies.org. And something nice that happened in 2008 with the passage of the Fostering Connections Act is that the federal government, most of these were state-funded prior to 2008. After 2008, the federal government said, you know, we really like this. The subsidized guardianship is a great option for relatives. We want to put some federal funding in place to support that. And that is an option that your state can take. It doesn't mean that your state has to have this program. And to date, we have 30 states and 1 tribe who have submitted plans and been approved to allow for federally funded fostering connections subsidized guardianship, known as KINGAP. And we have 2 states that are currently awaiting approval from HHS to have their plans approved. And finally, we have adoption. So we're sort of on the continuum of different ways to have legal relationships between a caregiver and a child, a relative caregiver, adoption being really the most permanent. In order for an adoption to occur, the birth parent has to either be proven unfit and their parental rights terminated by a court, or they have to voluntarily give up their parental rights. Both parents typically have to have their parental rights terminated for a relative to adopt. The birth parent loses all rights and responsibilities, the right to visit, paid child support. They can come back into court and ask for custody to be restored to them, although on rare occasion, and in some states, we have seen terminations overturned, but it doesn't happen often. But I know Anna addressed this a little earlier. You know, I think for relatives, it's an excellent option if that's where the relative feels that they would like to be, you know, how they would like to be defined as a caregiver, and they want that permanent relationship with the child. I often hear from relatives, look, I'm the grandmother, I'm always going to be the grandmother, I don't want to be the mother. So really, you know, adoption is a fantastic option if it's right for the relative, but it's certainly nothing that works, you know, is the right option for everybody. If the child's exiting the child welfare system and being adopted by the relative, then they may be eligible to apply for what we call adoption assistance, which is a subsidy that will continue until the child is either 18, 19, 20, 21, depending on the state. And then finally, something I want to mention is, and it seems to be a growing trend, is that a lot of states have what we call open adoption laws, which allow the child, after an adoption, have contact with birth parents. Sometimes it's only for siblings, and about 30 states have open adoption laws, again, posted on grandfamilies.org, if you want to take a look and see if your state has some form of an open adoption law. Open adoption happen whether it's law or not.
Heidi, this is Leah. Someone just wrote in, can you clarify what is the federally funded Fostering Connections Act?
Yes. Okay. So in 2008, the federal government passed something called the Fostering Connections Act. And again, I'm only going to defer to grandfamilies.org for the information because that in and of itself is a 2 or 3 hour training. But basically that piece of federal legislation went into place in 2008 and really opened up a whole host of different areas to keep children connected to relatives. One of the areas that I was talking about was subsidized guardianship. And so if you want more information on that act, I really encourage you to read about it. Anna has written some fantastic, anywhere from 1 to 3 page legal analyses, which gives you sort of an overview of the act. So I would encourage you to read about that. In this context, it really is that the federal government is giving financial money, giving federal dollars to support subsidized guardianship to the states that choose that option. So I know that's sort of a short answer, but it is a pretty complicated law. And if you take a look at grandfamilies.org, we've got several pages devoted to it, so I would encourage you to read that. Just for purpose of time, I can't really go much further into that. So I hope that gives you enough, or at least directs you somewhere where you can get your answers. And I think at this point we're going to probably turn it over to Anna for resources and services. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Anna Beltran. I'm going to talk to you today about how we can help these families. So now we have their legal relationship kind of in order, and now what can we do? Well, as you all probably know, the resources can be really hard to find, and they vary dramatically from state to state. But what we do find that's pretty consistent across states and at the federal level and community organizations is that kinship care is in silos. So it's not like we can go to the kinship care agency at our state. We have to look here, there, and yonder to find out where we can help the families. So I've broken down these slides into kind of the various agencies that you're going to look to find services for the families. there's not much coordination either among these silos. A good starting point is grand fact sheets, and this is the link to them. And you'll see a drop-down menu there where you can pick your state, and there'll be some places to start for the families. So it'll give you the numbers of families in this caregiving relationship in your state. Then it'll give some programs and policies for your specific state. So that's a great place to start in helping the families. Another great place to start is the Brookdale Foundation Network. They are the largest network of support groups, support services for grandparents and other relatives raising children. And they are in almost every state, and in D.C. and in Puerto Rico. And the seed grant, they provide seed grants, and they can really flourish into a real array of services to help the family. So that's another good place to start and see how you can connect caregivers to those services. Kinship Navigator programs have been particularly successful for our families. Washington and New Jersey have some long-standing programs. Washington is probably the most robust program right now. They have 8.5 full-time navigators. And what navigators are, they basically walk the families through the services that they're eligible for. And in Washington, it's particularly hands-on. And they'll even go to court with the families. They'll do a number of things, go to the agencies, help them connect them to the specific benefit. Other states have more what is phone and web-based, like Connecticut has an online tool that could connect the caregivers in that state to the resources. They also have a phone number that caregivers can call. But all these programs, the purpose is to connect caregivers to services. And the federal government likes these programs so much, like Heidi mentioned, the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008 also provided for some money to provide family connection grants. And those grants fund more Kinship Navigator programs. And there have been 2 rounds of grants awarded. One was just awarded last September. And if you go to that link there at the end of this slide, you'll see where they are. So you might have one in your area that you can collaborate with, you can go to for services, you can find out what's happening in your state. The Benefits Online tool is another excellent starting point. On this, the caregivers can go in there, they can plug in their specific information, where they live, how much income they have, how many kids they're raising, real specific questions, and then it will spit out, it'll generate a list of what services they may qualify for. So it's a nice hands-on tool for the families. First silo I'm going to talk about is children. So this is a place that you can go to see if there are services for the families. And when I talk about children, this might be your state-level agency, or it might be a children's community organization. But one of the ways they help these families is through the foster care system, as Heidi's mentioned. Although it is a very small percentage of the children that we're talking about. They're about it's about 1 in 20. So there are about 20 children outside of foster care being raised by relatives to every one that's in the system. So they're much more outside the system. But if a child's in the system being raised by a licensed relative foster parent, they're going to get generally a lot more support than someone outside the system. As you can see, the national average monthly foster care payment is $511, and that's per child. So if the caregiver is raising 2 children that are foster children, then that would be over $1,000. And not only do they get that financial support, but they typically get all kinds of help accessing services. So the system helps them enroll the children in school. It helps them do a number of things. Another service that can be provided through children's agencies is child care. And child care is a big area for our grandparents, our working grandparents. It could be a big challenge. A lot of states don't provide as much child care as working grandparents need. Some states do a better job of it. Washington State uses its child care money available here through the federal government in addition to its temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, or welfare money, and it kind of combines those and serves working grandparents. And the neat thing in Washington is that if you have two kinship caregivers in a family, so you say you have grandma and grandpa, only one of them has to be working full-time to get or to be eligible for child care benefits. Now, another big silo, and some place that sometimes people don't think to look, is aging, the aging network. And as one of the big programs that can help our population is the National Family Caregiver Support Program that's now been around for over 12 years. And it's part of the Older Americans Act. And because it's part of the Older Americans Act, it has an age limit. So the caregiver has to be over age 55 or older and raising a grandchild or a child. But there's no legal relationship requirement here. We fought hard at Generations United for that. And there are 5 categories of supportive services that can be provided to these families through area agencies on aging. And every area has got one of these, what we call AAAs. So you would just contact the AAA in your area. Now, a caveat is that some AAAs do not provide services to these caregivers. They're not required to. They're only allowed to. And they can spend up to 10% of their money on grandparents and other relatives raising grandchildren. The program was actually designed for people like me, middle-aged people, caring for their older relatives. But we at Generations United said, well, yeah, older people are often the recipients of care, but they're also often the givers of care, and so we wanted to acknowledge them as such. And so there is money for them, and it's worthwhile to reach out to your AAA, and even if they're not providing services, at least you inform them that there's a need. And perhaps there's a possibility of your agency collaborating with them to help these families. Lifespan respite is another part of the aging silo. This provides, well, respite, so a break, basically, to caregivers so that they can attend to their own needs, because what we find is grandma often doesn't go to the doctor for herself. She makes sure that her grandkids get to the doctor, but she neglects her own health. So this gives her the opportunity to get to the doctor or to go do her grocery shopping without toddlers in tow or whatever it may be. And in 2010 and 2011, federal grants were given to 18 states. And you can go to that link here on this slide and see if your state is one of them. Now, the other big silo, well, one of the other big silos is economic security, or it could be called temporary assistance for needy families in your state. A lot of states call it something else, but it's basically welfare, what we know as welfare. Well, that's what we used to call it anyway. But as I say, a lot of states do tweak it or call it something else. But there are basically 2 types of TANF grants. One is child-only grants. So these grants are usually smaller, and they typically only consider the caregiver, the income of the child, the income of the child, and they're for the care of the child. We've seen a disturbing trend in the West of starting to count caregiver income in determining eligibility for these child-only grants. 4 states are now doing that: Washington, Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon. And we hope not to see more states doing that. Now, these grants are typically quite small in comparison to other things and in comparison to foster care in particular, because as you can see, it's $8 a day as a national average, and rather than multiplying for additional children, it just goes up incrementally. Family grants under TANF are typically larger than child-only grants, but these are subject to federal work requirements and time limits. Under the old welfare program, there were kind of federal exemptions to those, which no longer exist, but some states still have them. So you could go to this database here through the Urban Institute and see if your state's one of them that has an exemption. They may exempt 55-year-old and older, or someone caring for a small child. That type of exemption often exists. Healthcare, another big silo. Medicaid and CHIP, they're big private health insurance programs that are so important for our families to make sure that these children have the health care they need. There are varying degrees of difficulty in accessing this public health insurance. Some states have some barriers. The Children's Defense Fund did a survey several years back and found that there was 1 or 2 states that required legal custody or guardianship, a couple of other states that had kind of harsh documentation requirements, proving that the grandparent was raising the grandchild. I don't know, unfortunately, how those barriers are now, but anecdotally, we don't hear a lot about barriers. Now, those are the public programs. Private health insurance can still be a barrier for some families. Many policies allow grandparents who have legal custody of the child to enroll that child in their private health insurance. Some don't even require legal custody, but most require adoption, so to actually be the parent. So that can be a big challenge for working grandparents, is getting them on their private health insurance. The Affordable Act, or Obamacare, addressed many things, but it didn't address that issue of how dependency is defined at the federal level. There's been legislation circulating since the early 90s to try to force a uniform definition in private insurance policies for dependency so that you can get these children enrolled in the private insurance policies, but it's not, unfortunately, part of Obamacare. But there are lots of key provisions that help our families, and there's a nice summary of the law at this link here. Another huge silo is agriculture, and looking at, that's what it's called at the federal level anyway, and looking at what kind of food programs the families can qualify for. There's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which we used to call food stamps. And for this program, you don't need legal custody or guardianship of the children to apply. You can go to that link for more information. Then there's the Women, Infants, and Children's Program. And again, you don't have to have legal custody or guardianship of the children for this program. And then finally, there's the National School Breakfast and Lunch Programs, and they provide free or reduced lunch. And this, you would have to ask the child's school teacher or principal for an application to apply to that. But that can be a very useful program for children being raised by grandparents. Education. This is, can be a big challenge without a legal relationship, because caregivers often get stuck in this kind of catch-22 where they're subject to these compulsory attendance laws. So they're supposed to be sending the kids to school, and they can be, charged with all kinds of problems if they're not sending the kids to school, but at the same time they might not be able to enroll the children in school because they don't have legal custody or guardianship. And this is because of states have what they're called residency requirements, which require, Heidi touched on this, which require, typically residency follows the parent. So the child's supposed to enroll in school where the parent lives. So it can be a challenge when grandma's raising the child, or aunt and uncle. And the school districts do those things so that you avoid, say, sending your child to live with grandma just during the week because there's a better football team in her high school than in yours. So it's to avoid things like that. But what happens is our families get caught in that, in those requirements, and then have a problem enrolling the children in school. That's where those educational consent laws are so important, and we're going to try to get more of those passed. The more children won't be kept out of school. And then for special education benefits, we often hear anecdotally that grandparents raising grandchildren or aunts raising nieces require, the states require them to become surrogate parents, which is a little process, which is a process, I don't want to diminish it, in order to be part of the individualized education plan process. So in order to get them special ed services, they make the grandparents go through this hoop. Well, they shouldn't be required to go through that hoop, because at the federal level, parent is defined under special education law to include people standing in loco parentis, which means in the place of a parent, and they don't have to have any kind of legal custody or guardianship. So if you're finding that's a problem in your area, I encourage you to arm yourself with that provision of federal law and say, hey, you should be allowing grandma here to access special education services and to be part of that IEP, or individualized education plan process. And if you need the federal law provision, it's in that website there, linked at the end. Housing, another big silo to look to. And housing, what we find is the big challenge here is that for Section 8, subsidized housing, some jurisdictions require the caregivers to have legal custody. They will not recognize the grandfamily as a family without that legal custody. So like we've seen cases where grandma's got 5 kids in her studio apartment and the housing authority won't recognize them as a family because she doesn't have legal custody and give them a larger unit. There was a case like that in Boston that went on for, it was over 5 years of them living that way before they were recognized as a family and gotten a larger unit. So that's the big challenge. Now, under federal law, they should not be doing this. The local housing authority should not be doing it. Unfortunately, there's not a clear document to point to, but there's a combination of laws that show that it is not permissible. And there have been threatened lawsuits in this area, and we have seen jurisdictions struggle with it. So if your jurisdiction is having a problem with that, reach out to me, and I'll point you to some resources. Another, a program that can help our families, but this is only in some states, unfortunately, the way they read it, but it's the Family Unification Program. And this provides Section 8 housing vouchers to families who the Child Welfare Agency has certified that the children are at risk of entering foster care if they don't get their housing issues straightened out. And this program is typically used for parents, so parent-headed families where the children are at risk of entering foster care. But the word family can be interpreted to include grandfamilies, and it just depends on what your state does because it's not clear at the federal level. So Washington State, for example, does include grandfamilies in their definition of family. So if that's an issue in your state, I encourage you to reach out and figure out how you can get grandfamilies included. Now, there have been some very innovative things done for our population around the country. The first ground-up housing program for grandparents raising grandchildren was done in the South Bronx, and that's now been around for almost 8 years. And it has multiple units for these grandparents raising grandchildren and aunts and uncles. And there's a wide variety of services on site. So there's all kinds of programs set base where they provide caregiver support groups, where they provide tutoring for the kids after school. And then the units are designed with these families in mind. So there'll be intercoms in the bathroom, there are laundry facilities on every floor. So it's a great program that's gotten a lot of media attention. Even prior to that one in South Bronx, there was one in Baton Rouge. This wasn't a ground-up construction, but it was a renovation of a nursing home. And this has been going strong in Louisiana, and they also have services on site. Based on the success of those programs and work that we had been doing in the housing area, Generations United worked with Congress to try to enact Legacy, which is the first affordable housing law for grandparents and other relatives raising children. And that law passed now, I guess it's been almost 10 years. It's amazing how time flies. And it does 3 main things, which is it required a report to Congress, which was done, and you can see it there at that link. It required training of HUD staff, which Sherry mentioned in her introduction that we did through a satellite training with HUD, and 2 to 4 intergenerational housing demonstrations to see, how viable these housing programs were and how we could replicate more of them. Well, HUD wasn't doing the demonstrations until we went back and specifically got some money appropriated for that purpose in 2005. And with that money, HUD funded 2 legacy grantees, one in Chicago, and that housing is now open. It's 10 units of 3 and 4 bedrooms, and then one in rural Tennessee, and that's got 9 units of 2 bedrooms. So hopefully one of these housing programs is in your area, or maybe you'll get ideas to do more in your area, because they can really help these families with their housing issues. Another big silo is Social Security. And Social Security is often overlooked, but it can be an excellent source of financial support for the families. The children may be eligible based on their parents' work record, or based on their grandparents' work record. It's a complicated formula, but I encourage you to have your caregivers or to use yourself that benefits quick link that I mentioned at the beginning of the slides, where you input your money to see if you qualify or the caregivers you work with qualify for the Social Security. And there's also a fact sheet that Generations United put out, which kind of explains how they can qualify. But you can go to either of these links and it'll connect you with kind of how to figure it out if your specific situation qualifies, and the benefits quick link. Then there's supplemental security income, which is for disabled people who have limited income, and the children can also qualify if they're disabled. And I encourage you, there's a screening tool here on this link to look to see if you might qualify or your caregivers might qualify for that. And the last big silo I'm going to talk about, and at this time of year it's quite relevant, is revenue. So the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and whatever that's called at your state level. EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, can be a huge help to these families. It's lifted many people out of poverty. And the great thing, and what works with this, is that it's refundable. So even if the families don't owe enough taxes to pay, even if they don't earn enough to pay many taxes, they can still get cash from the IRS. So that's what refundable means, that they actually get a check from the IRS. And the caregiver would have to have these qualifying children in the house, and this is basically the eligibility requirements. So they have to be related or steps. They have to be under age 19 or 24 for a full-time student. But if they're disabled permanently and totally, then there's no age requirement. And they have to have lived with the grandparent or other relative for more than half the year. And I put a link at the bottom to explain a lot more about the Earned Income Tax Credit. But this can be a very successful tax credit to help the families that they can access. Then there's the Adoption Tax Credit. So this would help, subpopulation of our grandfamilies. But it helps people who adopt from the child welfare system or outside the child welfare system, so both. And it was refundable for 2 years, in 2010 and 2011. So if you adopted during that time, you could go back and amend your tax return and try to claim the credit. For this last tax year, it's not refundable, but you can deduct that much. You see the amount there, over $12,000 per child. And there's more information there on that IRS link about that one. Then there's the Child Tax Credit. And this is a tax credit that caregivers, basically any caregivers can claim for children under 17 who are dependent. But this is not refundable. Now, there's a nice tax credit that piggybacks on this child tax credit, and that's the additional child tax credit. So if your families don't make enough to and get less than the full amount of the child tax credit because they don't owe enough, they don't make enough to owe enough taxes to offset it, then they can use this tax credit, which is refundable. And there's more information about that at that link from the IRS. And keep in mind that all of these tax credits are not counted as income, so they won't jeopardize other benefits. Well, that is basically a snapshot of the benefits and supports that should be available in all states and places to look for them in all states. It has to be kind of a broad stroke just because it does vary so much state to state, but hopefully we gave you enough idea of places to look that you'll be able to see what's in your state, and if you don't have what you like in your state, to advocate for what you do need. Here are some additional resources. The grandfamilies.org that Heidi talked about, the AARP Grand Fact Sheets, which are on another slide as well. Thank you all for your time today. If you have any questions, we'll be glad to take them.
Anna, we do have a question that's come in, and that is, can a child receive money if a mother is on SSI and has not worked? And I think that is in reference to one of the financial slides you just went over.
That is a complicated question. I don't think I have enough information to answer that well. But you could email me offline, and I will do my darndest to help you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really complicated area that a lot of people have been studying and sort of arguing, and it's kind of come out differently in different states. So if you want to email Anna, and I'm going to share some resources with Anna, and we can kind of work it through for you.
Thank you. So Anna and Heidi's contact information are both up on the screen now. So if anyone else has questions, please feel free to write them in. We have a few more minutes. We can answer some questions.
Well, and Leah, this is Sherry again. I'll just go on and share a couple of information. And one of the questions we just got, well, will the slideshow be available afterwards? And just for folks that may have started a little bit later, yes. We will put a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of these slides will be available at the Generations United website. And we will, the follow-up email that you receive from this webinar will have the link, and you'll be able to access it. It probably won't go up until early next week because of the holiday. I also just want to alert folks that Generations United also has a conference every year, or every other year, and our conference is coming this summer. And as part of the conference, we will be presenting, we present an award to Grandfamilies. So it's an award that recognizes a person, including caregivers, or an organization that has made outstanding contributions to the field of grandparents and other relatives raising children. The deadline for this award is March 30th, and the application is also available at the Generations United website, which is www.gu.org. So we hope that we know that there are programs and people, caregivers within your service areas and your groups that would qualify for this type of award for their contributions. We also have now received another question. So they're asking with who can we work with in our states to advocate for better kinship policies?
Well, I would encourage you to start with that grand fact sheets and look at who's working in your state and who's helping the families, and then kind of you can develop a coalition. And also the Brookdale Foundation networks, find out who in your state is a grantee from them. Good luck with that.
I think Anna would and Heidi, I mean, would there also be opportunities to possibly connect with Jaya here on our staff at Generations United, because we have done national grand rallies in the past and worked with states to do state and local grand rallies. We don't have an initiative focus on that right now, but there is some information about those type of efforts that have happened in the past.
That's a very good point, Sherry, definitely. And if maybe we could share resources through this webinar.
Yeah, and I would say Anna's suggestion to sort of find out what's already happening in your state is good, because you certainly wouldn't want to spend a lot of time and energy pushing for some legislation or some change that people are already, grouped together and working towards. So trying to find out if there's already some movement in your state and just joining them, because obviously you can always use extra people and extra voices.
We have one more question that's come in, and then I know we've reached the end of our time, and that is the adoption credit is only if a child was adopted starting in 2010. Is that correct? And would it not work for adoptions in 2009?
Oh my goodness, that is a very good question. No, I believe it existed prior to 2010. The only reason I mentioned 2010 was because for those 2 years, 2010 and 2011, Obamacare made it refundable. So 2009 it wouldn't be refundable, is my understanding.
And the IRS has that all up on their website. If you go to their website, you can read the different years. But Anna, those 2 years are the only years that were of significant change. But yes, it's been around for a while.
All right. Well, we're going to respect everyone's time, and I want to just thank you, Heidi and Anna, for sharing all of your extensive expertise on this topic today, and also thank you to everyone who joined us for the webinar. Please visit Generations United website for more information, and don't hesitate to contact either of our presenters or Generations United if you have questions. just to reiterate that our conference is coming up this summer, and we do hope to see you in Washington, D.C. in July. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.